There are moments when you look into the mirror of your heart and recognize a pattern that hurts, yet one that seems to repeat itself inevitably. Every relationship you begin ends up tearing you apart, leaving scars you thought were long forgotten, and still, you fall into the same cycle once again. You feel as if your heart were a battlefield, your emotions prisoners of decisions you don't fully understand, and despite your best intentions, you always end up giving more than you receive. That sensation of emptiness, of recurring disappointment, of hurting yourself over and over again for someone who was never aligned with your well-being, can become unbearable. And in the middle of that internal storm, a persistent thought emerges. Why do I keep attracting relationships that hurt me? That is not a mere whim of life. It is a reflection of the disconnection between your reason and your emotions. Because the human mind tends to repeat patterns, and when pain becomes familiar, repetition feels almost inevitable. Observe the story of your affections, the same mistakes, the same mismatches, the same sense of insufficiency that doesn't truly come from them, but from the way you relate to yourself and to the idea of love. Each failed relationship leaves behind a lesson that we rarely explore. Have we truly understood what it means to love and to be loved in a healthy way? Or do we continue trusting in unrealistic expectations that bind us to someone who cannot sustain our inner worth? Imagine for a moment that each wound you've felt is not an accident, but a sign, a silent yet persistent sign, telling you that the way you connect is not aligned with virtue, with clarity, and with inner peace. The Stoics teach us that virtue is the supreme good, and that living in accordance with it is what allows us to navigate life without being dominated by emotions. So, if you attract harmful relationships again and again, it is not that the universe is conspiring against you, but that there is a disconnection. You are offering your heart without first having aligned it with your reason and your values. The blame is not on the other person. The root lies within you, within how you define virtue in love, how you manage your expectations, and how you sustain your well-being when no one else does it for you. This reflection does not arise to punish you or to drown you in guilt. It arises to confront you with the most honest truth. Your peace and your happiness do not depend on someone else. The repetition of painful relationships is not chance, but an opportunity to stop, to look with honesty, and to begin acting with discernment. Because the first step to breaking the negative cycle is recognizing that emotional dependence and misaligned expectations are what attract harm. You cannot control the decisions of others, nor predict the reaction of every heart you encounter, but you can control how you choose to interact, how you define your boundaries, and how you sustain your worth, even in solitude. Imagine for a moment the strength that arises when you learn to place your well-being before any bond. Imagine a serenity that does not falter in the face of rejection, abandonment, or disappointment. That strength is neither cold nor distant. It is the ability to love with clarity, to choose relationships aligned with virtue, and to let go of those that are not without feeling that you are losing your essence. The Stoics teach us that it is not about avoiding emotion or passion, but about guiding them with reason, about transforming instinctive reaction into conscious response. When you understand this, relationships stop being traps that tear you apart and become spaces where virtue, honesty, and authenticity can flourish. To achieve this, a profound change is necessary. Stop seeing love as a need others must fulfill, and start seeing it as a reflection of your own value. It means practicing emotional autarky, that self-sufficiency which does not wait for external validation to feel complete. It means evaluating each bond with honesty, asking yourself if it fosters justice, wisdom, temperance, and courage, or if it feeds destructive patterns that have followed you all your life. It means anticipating conflicts, not to live in fear, but to respond with serenity. It means separating the person from the emotional role they play in your life, and understanding that compassion is not obligation, that empathy does not require the sacrifice of your essence. Breaking the negative cycle is an act of courage. It is looking at past wounds without blaming yourself. It is transforming anxiety into discernment, and it is choosing dignified solitude over company that harms you. It is not about isolating yourself, but about building an inner space where your strength grows and your heart learns not to depend on what cannot sustain it. In this process, you will understand that the idea of the perfect soulmate is a myth that enslaves, that initial chemistry does not guarantee stability, and that true joy in love arises from shared virtue, not from external validation. And so, in the midst of this inner awakening, the question changes its tone from "why do they always hurt me?" to "what can I learn and how can I transform myself so that my relationships reflect my peace and my worth?" That is the doorway to relationships that nurture instead of destroy, to a love that does not exhaust but elevates, to an emotional freedom that depends on no one but yourself. Today is the moment to look within, to honestly accept your patterns, and to prepare yourself to love in a way that will never wound you again. Because when your heart aligns with reason, with virtue, and with stoic clarity, it stops attracting pain and begins to draw to itself what truly deserves to remain by your side. Healthy, profound, and sustainable relationships, where respect and authenticity prevail, and where your peace is no longer negotiable. Before we begin, I want you to declare your commitment by leaving in the comments, "From today on, I choose relationships that nurture me and do not harm me." That phrase will be a reminder that you are here to break negative cycles, not to tolerate bonds that wound. This is the moment to prove to yourself that you deserve respect, peace, and authentic connections that elevate your life. Without further ado, let us begin. First, Stoic lesson: define what virtue is in a relationship. Most of us enter relationships with a confused idea of what it truly means to love and to be loved. We believe that passion, closeness, or chemistry are enough to sustain a bond, and we quickly learn, sometimes painfully, that they are not. Relationships that hurt do not arise by chance. They are born from the disconnection between our inner values and the way we choose those we allow close to our hearts. The Stoics teach us that virtue is the supreme good, and when we apply it to love, it gives us a clear criterion to choose wisely and live with integrity. But what does it mean in concrete terms to live out virtue within a relationship? For the ancient philosophers, virtue was neither an abstract concept nor a spiritual luxury. It was a moral compass, the guiding force behind every decision and action. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca all agree that living in accordance with virtue allows our emotions not to drag us along, but to flow under the guidance of reason. When we apply this to love, we face a question that few dare to ask. Does this relationship bring me closer to wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage? If the answer is no, then no matter how intense or passionate the relationship may be, it is a detour away from our true well-being. Wisdom in a relationship does not mean controlling the other person, nor manipulating circumstances to fit our desires. Wisdom is the ability to see clearly who that person is, what they bring into your life, and above all, what they reflect about your own inner worth. A virtuous relationship is not one that avoids conflicts or disagreements, but one in which both individuals can grow together without betraying their principles or compromising their integrity. Here, love becomes fertile ground for human excellence, not a minefield of insecurities and unfulfilled expectations. Justice, on the other hand, reminds us that in a relationship we cannot and must not sacrifice ourselves to please the other to the point of erasing who we are. Justice in love demands mutual respect, respect toward the other, their boundaries and aspirations, but also respect for ourselves, for our emotional autonomy, and our right not to surrender our essence. When we allow injustice to creep in, tolerating harmful behaviors or sacrificing our peace just to maintain the illusion of union, we move away from virtue and expose ourselves to destructive patterns that wound us again and again. Temperance is perhaps the most silent yet profound aspect of virtue in love. It is not about repressing emotions, but about not letting passions and expectations dominate us. The virtuous person recognizes their desires and affections but manages them with discernment. They do not need the other person to constantly validate their worth or to provide absolute security in the relationship. Temperance allows us to experience love with intensity, but without losing internal stability. It means loving without need, engaging without dependence, and sharing without sacrificing our own integrity. Courage, finally, is the ability to face the truth as it is, without disguising it or running away from it. In the context of a relationship, this means having the bravery to leave bonds that are not virtuous, even when attraction, attachment, or habit are present. It implies confronting our own fears, accepting temporary solitude, and prioritizing authenticity over comfort. Courage allows us to say no to what harms us and yes to what nurtures us, without blaming the other or falling into victimhood. Understanding virtue in love also requires honestly observing how our feelings align with our actions. It is not enough to wish for the good. We must evaluate it in action. Seneca would remind us to look at every emotional decision and ask, does this choice reflect my integrity and the excellence I seek in life? Or am I giving in to convenience, fear, or disordered passion? The answer to this question reveals whether the relationship brings us closer to true good or drags us back into repeated patterns of suffering. A relationship built on virtue transforms the way we interact. Conversations become spaces of clarity, not manipulation. Conflicts are resolved with respect, not emotional violence. Closeness turns into shared growth, not dependence. Even rejection or loss is faced with serenity, because virtue teaches us that our happiness does not depend on the other person, but on our coherence with our principles and the inner strength we have cultivated. This approach allows us to see the difference between relationships that harm us and those that elevate us. Virtue acts as an invisible filter that protects us from unnecessary pain and guides us toward bonds, where wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage are not just words, but daily practices. In this way, love stops being an act of dependence and becomes a reflection of our inner maturity. The first lesson does not end in theory. Its strength lies in application. Every time you face the temptation to give in to harmful relationships, remember, a virtuous relationship is not perfect, but it is healthy. Evaluate each connection with brutal honesty and ask yourself, does this relationship bring me closer to virtue or drive me away from it? Only then can you break the cycle of relationships that wound and open yourself to bonds that nourish, elevate, and respect your inner worth. Virtue is not a distant ideal, it is the most powerful tool you have to transform your emotional life. Learning to apply it in every emotional decision will allow you to look back without regrets, live the present with clarity, and build a future where your relationships reflect the peace and strength that should have always been with you. To understand virtue in love is, in essence, to understand that your well-being is sacred, and that only when you choose with wisdom and courage can you stop repeating the pattern of pain. Second Stoic lesson: examine your inner expectations. The pain we feel in relationships does not always come from the other person. Often it is born from what we project onto them, from the expectations we construct in our minds and expect to be fulfilled as if they were universal commandments. Expecting someone to fill our inner voids, to act according to our desires, to understand our emotional world without us explaining it, is a subtle yet powerful trap. Epictetus would warn us, do not demand that things happen as you wish. Wish them to happen as they do happen. This phrase contains an essential principle. Suffering arises when we confuse reality with our idea of how reality should be, and when we expect others to align with our illusions. Every relationship has its own logic, its own limits, its own shadows. Yet we enter into bonds carrying unexamined expectations, silent demands, and implicit requirements that we rarely communicate clearly. We expect the other person to be the one who makes us feel complete, to act as a mirror of our desire for security and acceptance, and when they fail, we justify our disappointment. But the Stoic truth is that no one can fill what only you can complete: peace, stability, and a sense of self-worth. To begin breaking this pattern, we need an act of brutal honesty, to look within ourselves and recognize what we truly seek in a relationship and why. Ask yourself, am I expecting someone to compensate for my shortcomings, calm my fears, or validate my existence? Or am I seeking a companion who complements my life, respecting both our autonomy and boundaries? The difference may seem subtle, but it completely transforms the way we relate. Unexamined expectations are the root of emotional dependence. Inner clarity is the seed of emotional freedom. Epictetus would teach us to distinguish between what lies within our control and what does not. Your emotions, your decisions, your personal growth, these are yours. The thoughts, behaviors, and feelings of the other person are not. Yet we tend to invest energy in trying to control the uncontrollable, to grow frustrated when the other does not act as we would like, to live with anxiety over outcomes we can never guarantee. This attitude chains us to disappointment and perpetuates the cycle of relationships that wound us. Examining our inner expectations means taking responsibility for our own peace and ceasing to expect that someone else will sustain it for us. The first practical step is constant self-observation. Before reacting to a conflict, a disagreement, or a misunderstanding, pause and analyze. Am I upset because the other person truly harmed me, or because they did not meet the expectation I had of how they should behave? This distinction can be eye-opening. Understanding that the source of suffering is an unmet expectation allows us to respond with serenity, not impulse, with compassion, not resentment. Clarity about our expectations also protects us from choosing poorly the people around us. When we are aware of our desires and limits, we can evaluate whether a relationship has the potential to be balanced or whether we are projecting our needs onto someone who can never sustain them. Honesty with ourselves about what we need and what we can offer prevents us from binding ourselves to toxic bonds out of fear of loneliness or illusions of external fulfillment. Every time we impose our expectations without reflection, we build invisible prisons, cells of disappointment that replicate in every new relationship. Examining our inner expectations does not mean giving up hope or the joy of love. It means aligning them with reality and virtue. It means transforming anxiety into discernment and demand into clarity. It is learning to ask for what is necessary without demanding the impossible, to share without depending, to give of ourselves without losing our center. The Stoics teach us that true emotional freedom arises when we understand that our expectations must be consistent with the nature of things and with our own inner strength, not with idealized fantasies of how others should act. This work of introspection is constant and profound. Every disappointment, every disillusionment, every frustration is an opportunity to ask ourselves, what part of my suffering comes from reality, and what part from my own unrealistic expectations? By answering honestly, we begin to free ourselves from the repetitive cycle of relationships that hurt us. We learn to sustain ourselves emotionally, to be complete within ourselves, and to relate from clarity, not from lack. Ultimately, examining our inner expectations teaches us to value what truly matters: authenticity, mutual respect, and coherence with virtue. Each time we stop demanding the impossible and start to understand and accept what is, we open space for balanced relationships. The examined expectation becomes a tool of discernment, not a trap of suffering. And in that transformation, silent yet powerful, We discover that love ceases to be a source of constant pain and becomes a reflection of our own wisdom, strength, and inner peace. Third Stoic lesson: practice emotional self-sufficiency. There is a truth that few dare to face. Much of the pain we feel in relationships comes from depending emotionally on someone else in order to feel complete. To love should never mean to lose autonomy, nor to expect the other person to hold our inner peace as though it were their obligation. Emotional self-sufficiency, a central concept in Stoicism, teaches us that our stability and well-being depend on our own inner strength, not on the actions, words, or feelings of others. This principle is liberating and at the same time challenging. It requires us to honestly examine what we have delegated to others and to assume responsibility for our own balance. Epictetus reminds us that we do not control the emotions of others nor the behaviors of those around us. Yet we tend to pour our energy into trying to change them, expecting love, validation, and security from external sources, forgetting that the only thing truly within our control is our mind and our response to events. Emotional self-sufficiency arises when we recognize this truth and begin to nurture our inner peace through our own will, through conscious decisions, and through coherence with our values. Practicing self-sufficiency does not mean becoming cold or distant. It means strengthening an inner core that does not depend on applause, affection, or approval. It means being able to love and to relate without letting fear of loss or the need to be wanted dictate our actions. Before entering into a bond, ask yourself, can I sustain my well-being even if this relationship ended tomorrow? Am I capable of facing absence, disappointment, or distance without feeling that my life collapses? The answers to these questions reveal whether we are ready to love in a healthy way, or whether we are still placing our stability in someone else's hands. Emotional self-sufficiency also translates into clarity when making decisions about our emotional life. When we cultivate this inner autonomy, we do not need to justify harmful relationships or remain in them out of fear of abandonment. We can consciously choose with whom to share our time and affection, and we can step away from bonds that do not respect our peace. Instead of reacting impulsively to the intensity of attraction or the force of passion, the Stoic observes, evaluates, and acts with reason. This clarity is an invisible shield that protects us from repeated pain and allows us to build relationships rooted in respect and authenticity. The process of developing emotional self-sufficiency requires constant training of both mind and heart. Daily introspection helps us recognize when our feelings depend on others and when they arise from our own stability. Each conflict, each rejection, each disappointment is an opportunity to strengthen this virtue. Rather than reacting with anxiety, jealousy, or despair, we learn to respond with serenity and discernment. Self-sufficiency enables us to stand firm even when life presents us with the inevitable loss of someone we love without our inner peace shattering. Self-sufficiency also transforms our perception of love. It frees us from the myth that we need someone else in order to be happy and teaches us that a relationship is a complement, not a vital necessity. When we are emotionally self-sufficient, we can offer love from abundance, not from lack. The relationship ceases to be a space of dependency and anxiety and becomes a place where both individuals can grow, share, and nurture one another without compromising integrity or freedom. Joy ceases to depend on the other and begins to flow from our own virtue and self-awareness. By practicing self-sufficiency, we also learn to recognize bonds that are unworthy of our emotional investment. We can identify patterns of dependence, manipulation, or emotional entanglement that once went unnoticed. The clarity that emerges from self-sufficiency allows us to see honestly when a bond brings growth and when it perpetuates pain. It allows us to choose consciously, not out of need or fear, but in coherence with our well-being and the principles we have chosen to follow. Ultimately, emotional self-sufficiency teaches us a profound lesson. True love never demands that we give up our peace. Emotional dependence traps us in cycles of suffering. Self-sufficiency frees us to experience healthy, authentic, and balanced relationships. When we are capable of sustaining our inner stability without depending on another, we stop attracting destructive bonds and begin creating relationships where respect, virtue, and clarity form the foundation. Self-sufficiency is not isolation. It is strength. It is not coldness. It is freedom. It is not selfishness. It is coherence with oneself and with the nature of life. This lesson invites us to look inward and to assume responsibility for our own well-being, remembering that only when we are self-sufficient can we love consciously, fully, and serenely. Emotional self-sufficiency is, in essence, the foundation of all healthy relationships, the inner space where our peace no longer depends on anyone else and where love is lived from virtue and clarity, not from need or desperation. Fourth Stoic lesson: take a moral inventory, not a romantic one. The repeated pain in relationships often arises from a distorted view of love. We evaluate bonds solely through the intensity of our emotions, through the chemistry or passion we feel, without pausing to consider whether we are acting with integrity and coherence. The Stoics teach us that the true guide for choosing wisely does not come from a heart clouded by attraction or dependence, but from a deep examination of our values and actions. This examination is the moral inventory, a conscious and unflinching analysis of how we behave and what sacrifices we are willing to make for love without confusing emotion with righteousness. Seneca affirmed that it is not the strength of feeling that defines the goodness of a relationship, but the moral quality of the decisions we make within it. Every bond reflects patterns we have repeated without questioning. We tolerate disrespect, accept subtle manipulations, and set aside our integrity in the name of the illusion of love. Looking at these choices honestly allows us to detect cycles that have repeated and led us time and again into relationships that wound. To take a moral inventory means to observe without guilt or self-deception, identifying where we have given more than our virtue allowed and which values we have compromised out of convenience, fear, or need. The first step is sincere introspection. Review past relationships and examine how you acted in each conflict. Did you respond from serenity and reason, or from impulsivity and fear of loss? Were your decisions aligned with justice, temperance, and honesty, or did you give in to disordered passion and emotional dependence? This examination is not meant to judge, but to reveal invisible patterns that until now have guided your choices automatically. Each relationship is a mirror that reflects not only the other person, but also your own weaknesses and strengths. In a moral inventory, the focus is on personal coherence, not on blaming the other. Recognizing that we repeat similar mistakes does not mean assuming all the blame, but rather accepting responsibility for our decisions and actions. The clarity that emerges from this analysis allows us to distinguish between what we can change within ourselves and what is beyond our control. It teaches us that suffering is not inevitable, but the result of patterns we can break through conscious observation and rectitude in our future choices. This inventory also requires honesty about what we are willing to tolerate. Many remain in harmful relationships out of fear of loneliness, out of attachment, or because of the illusion that passion justifies suffering. Virtue urges us to ask, is this relationship compatible with the person I want to be and the values I want to preserve? Or am I sacrificing my integrity and well-being in the name of a feeling that guarantees nothing but repeated pain? Identifying these choices allows us to act with courage, freeing ourselves from bonds that do not deserve our emotional investment. The exercise of a moral inventory is not limited to visible actions, but also examines inner motivations. Why do we allow certain behaviors? Out of fear, need, or guilt? Deep self-awareness reveals patterns that would otherwise remain hidden. the tendency to please without limits, the habit of justifying the other's faults, the inclination to confuse emotional intensity with true well-being. Recognizing these motivations allows us to intervene before history repeats itself, applying reason and virtue as the guide for future decisions. By taking a moral inventory, we also learn to separate emotion from judgment. It is not about eliminating feelings, but about evaluating them in the light of our values. A relationship may be intense, passionate, or exciting, but if it sacrifices our integrity, it remains harmful. Moral clarity gives us the strength to say no when emotion says yes, and to choose relationships that reflect our inner coherence rather than our momentary emotional needs. Finally, this inventory prepares us to build conscious and balanced relationships. It allows us to identify repeated patterns, understand our past choices, and make informed decisions that respect our virtue. Each future bond can be evaluated honestly. Does it foster my growth and integrity, or does it drag me back into repeating past mistakes? In this way, love ceases to be a ground of emotional chaos and becomes a space where clarity, justice, and temperance guide every interaction. Taking a moral inventory is not an exercise in perfection, but in preparation. Every harmful relationship we have experienced teaches us what we must not tolerate and reveals the principles that must guard our hearts. Applying this lesson allows us to break the cycle of relationships that hurt and to build bonds where virtue, respect, and personal coherence are the solid foundation of every emotional encounter. Fifth Stoic lesson: practice the premeditatio malorum in love. Love is an uncertain territory. What seems secure today can collapse tomorrow, and what we cherish deeply can turn into a source of unexpected pain. Most people live in a state of illusion. They believe everything will follow a favorable course, that the relationship will continue without breakups, conflicts, or disappointments. When reality proves otherwise, the shock is deep and the suffering unavoidable. The Stoics, however, teach us a different path. The premeditatio malorum, or the conscious anticipation of misfortunes, a practice that prepares us to face adversity without being consumed by it. In the context of love, this practice gives us an emotional strength that breaks dependence and transforms our reaction to loss and disappointment. Imagine for a moment that every possible painful scenario is not a punishment, but a preparation. Imagine contemplating the possibility of conflict, betrayal, or abandonment before it happens, not to live in fear, but to train the mind in serenity and clarity. The premeditatio malorum is not pessimism or defeatism. It is an act of wise realism, an exercise in anticipation that strengthens our ability to choose with coherence and to maintain inner peace in the face of the inevitable. When we train our mind in this practice, we learn to distinguish what depends on us from what does not, and to respond with virtue instead of reacting with despair. Epictetus would remind us that nothing external can harm us unless we allow it. Losses, slights, or conflicts are not bad in themselves. They are only bad to the extent that our mind perceives them as unbearable threats. The premeditatio malorum trains us to change that perception. By contemplating the possibility of loss, we reduce the emotional impact when it occurs and strengthen our ability to act with serenity. In love, this means not depending on another person to feel secure or happy, and preparing ourselves to accept the transience of bonds without allowing our inner stability to fracture. Practicing this anticipation requires honesty and courage. It is not easy to imagine scenarios of abandonment, disappointment, or betrayal, especially when we are in love or desire the relationship to flourish. Yet this exercise allows us to explore vulnerability before it strikes without warning. Ask yourself, what would happen if this relationship ended tomorrow? How would I react? Could I sustain my well-being without the other person by my side? These questions are not meant to plant fear, but to cultivate emotional autonomy and clarity in action. Moreover, the premeditatio malorum teaches us to value what we have in the present. By contemplating loss, we recognize the fragility of bonds and learn to appreciate them without obsessive attachment. This practice does not diminish love or shared joy. On the contrary, it intensifies them because it allows us to live each moment fully with awareness and gratitude without relying on the illusion of absolute permanence. Emotional intensity is transformed into shared virtue, not into inevitable suffering. The premeditatio malorum also strengthens resilience in the face of inevitable conflicts. Each argument, misunderstanding, or difference of opinion ceases to be a catastrophic threat and becomes an opportunity to practice temperance, justice, and courage. Conscious anticipation enables us to respond with clarity instead of being dragged away by impulse. It helps us to maintain inner peace even in the midst of turbulence, proving that our stability does not depend on the behavior of the other person, but on our ability to manage our own emotions. Applying the premeditatio malorum in love requires constancy. Every time you enter into an emotional bond, mentally review possible adverse scenarios and visualize how you would respond with virtue. This preparation does not diminish passion or closeness. It strengthens autonomy and the ability to choose consciously, preventing the fear of loss from chaining us to harmful or unsatisfying relationships. By training the mind in this way, we learn that love can coexist with emotional independence, that joy can be complete without depending on constant approval from another, and that loss, though painful, does not destroy our essence. Ultimately, the premeditatio malorum gives us a radical change of perspective. We transform fear into preparation, anxiety into clarity, and dependence into autonomy. By practicing it, we stop fearing pain and begin to understand that true love is not based on external security, but on inner strength. The relationship ceases to be an emotional trap and becomes a space where virtue and serenity guide every choice, where love does not mean dependence, and where inner peace remains intact, even in the face of inevitable loss or conflict. When you keep attracting relationships that hurt you, it is not you who decides, it is your patterns, your expectations, and your fear that govern your bonds. You wake up each day feeling that you are repeating the same mistakes, that you give and receive harm, and that tranquility is a luxury that never arrives. That is why subscribing is not a minor gesture. It is an act of liberation. Here you will not find empty phrases or superficial promises. You will receive weekly Stoic tools, profound lessons, and clear reminders to break negative cycles, establish boundaries, and reclaim the inner peace you deserve. Subscribing means arming yourself with clarity, training your mind, and choosing relationships that elevate you instead of draining you. Not subscribing means staying trapped in the same pattern, carrying wounds that could be avoided, disappointments that repeat, and the sense that your emotional life will never be fair to you. Subscribing is deciding that your well-being matters, that your dignity is worth defending, and that your inner peace is a priority. If you recognize in yourself those signs of repeated pain, do not ignore this moment. Transformation does not come with good intentions, it comes with brave decisions. Subscribing today is committing to yourself, to your clarity, and to relationships that truly deserve your time and your love. Each episode may be the strategy, reflection, or teaching that keeps you from falling back into the same destructive cycles. Your life was not made to merely survive the harm of others, but to be lived with freedom, clarity, and virtue. Do it now. Subscribe, because your peace and your inner strength deserve action, not excuses. Sixth Stoic lesson: separate the person from the emotional role. In relationships, we often confuse people with the roles they play in our emotional lives. We fall in love with the idea that someone will complete us, care for us, or make us feel important, and from that expectation, we construct an emotional role that the other person must fulfill. Yet this projection is dangerous. It places an impossible burden on the other and distances us from clarity and emotional freedom. The Stoics teach us to look at each human being with compassion, but also with realism, to recognize that we may feel affection, admiration, or gratitude for someone without confusing them with the obligation to sustain our emotional well-being. Separating the person from their emotional role is an act of maturity and justice toward both. Marcus Aurelius reminds us that every human being lives with their own limitations, wounds, and contradictions. No one can be perfect or fulfill our expectations without faltering. Empathy is necessary to maintain connection and understanding, but it must not become an excuse to tolerate emotional dependence or to justify behaviors that harm us. To see someone with compassion means to accept their imperfections, but it also means protecting ourselves from taking on responsibilities that are not ours. We are not the saviors, nor are we the absolute guardians of another's happiness. This principle translates into inner freedom. When we stop confusing the person with the role they are supposed to play in our lives, we reduce anxiety and disappointment. Emotions no longer drag us into frustration because we understand that the other has no duty to satisfy our deepest needs. Clarity arises when we recognize that we can choose to love or to step away, to understand or to withdraw, without losing our center or sacrificing our peace. The first step is honest observation. Distinguish between the person you love and the expectation you have imposed upon them. Ask yourself, am I valuing this person for who they truly are, or for what I need them to be in order to feel complete? This question is more powerful than it seems because it reveals patterns of codependence and emotional dependence that, if left unchecked, repeat themselves again and again in harmful relationships. Separating the person from the emotional role means becoming aware of these dynamics and acting with prudence and responsibility. This separation also allows us to recognize the humanity of the other. We all carry invisible burdens, traumas that condition us, and limitations that prevent us from always acting according to the expectations of those around us. Understanding this does not mean accepting abuse or disrespect. It means being able to see the other with realism and compassion without confusing affection with obligation. Virtue, in this context, consists in balancing empathy with clarity, kindness with discernment. Moreover, separating the person from the emotional role allows us to respond rationally in moments of conflict. Anger, disappointment, or resentment often arise because we feel the other has failed to fulfill our idealized role. By recognizing that the expectation is ours and not the other's obligation, we can transform destructive emotion into reflection and conscious action. Justice, toward ourselves and toward the other, guides us to maintain clear boundaries without yielding to impulsivity or unnecessary sacrifice. This principle also strengthens our ability to choose healthy relationships. When evaluating future bonds, we can distinguish between people who complement our lives authentically and those who might trap us in dynamics of dependence or frustration. Separating the person from the emotional role teaches us that no one needs to play out a script to deserve our affection. We can love from freedom, respecting ourselves and the other. The constant practice of this lesson transforms our perception of intimacy and closeness. It allows us to share affection without anxiety, maintain connection without fear, and set boundaries without guilt. The person ceases to be a means to our well-being and becomes an autonomous being with whom we can interact from virtue, clarity, and serenity. Finally, separating the person from the emotional role teaches us a profound Stoic lesson. To love is not to depend, to protect is not to possess, and to understand is not to justify. Inner freedom arises when we recognize that our stability does not depend on someone fulfilling a specific emotional role, but on our own capacity to sustain ourselves with integrity, compassion, and discernment. This balance enables us to build authentic relationships where virtue and clarity guide every decision and where inner peace remains intact, even in the face of the complexity and challenges of human love. Seventh Stoic lesson, master eupathia, rational emotions. The most common mistake in human relationships is believing that emotions must be repressed in order to avoid suffering. The Stoics do not seek to eliminate feeling, they seek to transform it into something that serves reason and virtue. Marcus Aurelius taught us that it is not about fleeing from what we feel, but about guiding our responses so that our emotions align with wisdom. Eupatheia, or rational emotion, is the central concept to achieve this, the ability to experience joy, sadness, or affection without being dragged away by them, always maintaining control over our actions and decisions. In the context of relationships, mastering eupatheia means not depending on another's validation, affection, or reaction in order to experience emotional well-being. When we enter a relationship without this ability, we become puppets of the other's moods. A word of disapproval, a distant gesture, or a slight criticism can trigger anxiety, anger, or despair. Eupatheia teaches us to observe these emotions without confusing them with the need to act impulsively or to react in desperation. We feel, but we are not possessed. We perceive, but we are not lost. We love, but without dependence. This internal change is profound and transformative. It allows us to relate with clarity, respect, and balance. The first step in cultivating eupatheia is conscious self-observation. Each time you feel an intense reaction to your partner's behavior or to a conflict, ask yourself, does this emotion arise from the reality of the situation or from my interpretation and expectations? Am I reacting to what is truly happening or to what I imagine should be happening? Recognizing this distinction is crucial. Most emotional suffering comes from our interpretations, not from the facts themselves. Eupatheia also involves nurturing positive emotions rooted in virtue. Joy arises when we act with integrity, justice, and temperance. Compassion arises when we understand human limitations without sacrificing ourselves. Affection arises when we can offer it freely, without expecting reciprocity or validation. This transformation turns every emotional experience into an exercise in inner growth, where emotion ceases to be a tyrant and becomes an ally of our strength and wisdom. Another key aspect is preparation for adversity. Rational emotions allow us to face conflicts, disappointments, or breakups without losing serenity. Instead of reacting with resentment, fear, or despair, we evaluate the situation with clarity and choose the most fitting action. Sadness may exist, but it does not dominate. Love may persist, but it does not enslave. Loss may hurt, but it does not destroy. Eupatheia teaches us to integrate emotion and reason so that every experience strengthens our autonomy and clarity. The practice of eupatheia requires consistency and discipline. Each day, each interaction, each emotional challenge is an opportunity to train the mind and the heart. By practicing conscious observation and transformation of our emotions, we learn to maintain inner peace, even in complex relationships or when faced with frustration and disappointment. Over time, eupatheia becomes a deep habit. Emotion remains, but it no longer dictates our decisions nor compromises our stability. Mastering eupatheia also allows us to love in a more authentic and balanced way. We no longer seek the other to make us feel good, nor do we cling to relationships that generate only dependence. We can offer affection from freedom, respond with tenderness without fear, and make decisions based on values and virtue rather than emotional impulses. The relationship ceases to be a source of anxiety and becomes a space of growth, understanding, and mutual respect. Finally, understanding eupatheia teaches us that true emotional strength does not consist in eliminating feeling, but in transforming it into an instrument of discernment and wisdom. Each emotion becomes a guide, each emotional experience a lesson, and each challenge an opportunity to strengthen our autonomy and clarity. By mastering our rational emotions, we break the cycle of suffering that arises from emotional dependence and begin to create bonds that reflect virtue, respect, and serenity. establishing healthy relationships that do not destroy us but elevate us. Eighth Stoic lesson: break the myth of the soulmate. From a young age, we are taught the idea that there exists the right person, the perfect love, or the soulmate destined to complete us. This belief, though romantic, is one of the most subtle and destructive traps for those seeking healthy relationships. Stoicism teaches us that everything is transient, that life and bonds are in constant change, and that the idea of a single individual capable of guaranteeing our happiness is a dangerous illusion. Believing in the one ties us to harmful relationships out of fear of losing what we consider irreplaceable, and blinds us to the possibility of building healthy connections with other people who share our values and mutual respect. Attachment to the myth of the soulmate generates unrealistic expectations. We expect the other person to fulfill an almost divine ideal, and when they inevitably fail, we feel disappointed, betrayed, or empty. This perspective not only condemns our relationships to dissatisfaction, but also makes us responsible for sustaining an impossible standard. Stoic virtue invites us to look beyond fantasy. A relationship is not measured by the perfection of the other person, but by the coherence with our values, the quality of communication, respect, and the ability to grow together without losing our integrity. The soulmate myth also reinforces emotional dependence. We think that without that person, our life has no meaning, that happiness depends on a single bond. This thought is a silent prison that makes us accept harmful behaviors, remain in relationships that wound us, and fear solitude. Stoicism teaches the opposite. Inner strength and emotional autonomy are the foundation of healthy relationships. When we are emotionally self-sufficient, we do not seek our completeness in another person. We can offer love from freedom, not from need. Breaking this myth means changing the inner narrative, understanding that true love does not consist in finding a predestined being, but in consciously choosing to share life with someone who respects our peace and inspires us to be better. There are many people with whom we can create balanced bonds as long as we cultivate clarity, virtue, and emotional responsibility. Freedom arises from realizing that there is not a single emotional destiny, but multiple paths on which we can build authentic relationships. Acceptance of transience is fundamental. The Stoics remind us that everything changes, that nothing remains the same, and that clinging to the illusion of eternity or exclusivity generates suffering. In love, this means recognizing that relationships can end, that bonds evolve, and that our peace should not depend on someone fulfilling a fixed role in our lives. This perspective allows us to enjoy affection, intimacy, and closeness without letting loss turn into emotional tragedy. Breaking the soulmate myth also teaches us to evaluate others with realism. We can feel attraction, affection, and attachment, but always with clarity about who they are and what they bring, instead of projecting fantasies onto them. This vision protects us from idealizations that distort perception and drag us into unbalanced or destructive relationships. By practicing discernment and evaluating compatibility based on values and virtues, we reduce the likelihood of repeating patterns of suffering. Moreover, freeing ourselves from this illusion allows us to take responsibility for our own happiness. Emotional life ceases to be a game of chance, dependent on fortuitous encounters, and becomes a space of conscious decisions. Choosing with clarity, setting boundaries, and prioritizing our integrity becomes natural. Inner strength becomes the main guide, and love transforms into a conscious act of sharing and growing, not into a desperate need for external completeness. Ultimately, breaking the myth of the soulmate is an act of liberation. It allows us to love without fear, to choose without dependence, and to live relationships where virtue, clarity, and serenity are the foundation. Understanding that there is no single predestined being gives us the freedom to create bonds that truly nurture and respect our essence, leaving behind the illusion that perpetuates cycles of pain and emotional dependence. Love ceases to be an emotional trap and becomes a space of growth, authenticity, and inner strength. Ninth Stoic lesson: use reason to restrain chemistry. Emotional and physical attraction can be intense, even overwhelming. The heart races, the mind clouds, and we feel as though we have found something irreplaceable. Yet the Stoics remind us that passion is no guarantee of a healthy bond. Chemistry can seduce us and trap us in an illusion of deep connection while we ignore clear signs of incompatibility or behavioral patterns that will eventually lead us to suffering. Discernment and reason must act as lighthouses in the midst of this emotional storm, to observe, to evaluate, and to decide with clarity before emotion drags us into relationships that wound us. Marcus Aurelius taught that we must not allow ourselves to be ruled by impulses or momentary desires. Chemistry can be intoxicating, but it is transient. Virtue, coherence, and mutual respect are enduring. A Stoic knows that feeling attraction does not mean the relationship is worth developing. The initial impulse must be examined in the light of reason, evaluating compatibility of values, reciprocity, integrity, and the capacity to grow together without compromising inner peace. In this way, passion is transformed into a conscious experience, not a tyrant dictating rushed decisions. Restraining chemistry with reason requires awareness of one's own patterns. Many repeat impulsive choices, letting themselves be carried away by the intensity of the moment, ignoring warning signs, control, manipulation, lack of respect, or incompatibility of goals. The initial attraction can cloud perception, but Stoic practice teaches us to observe without reacting, to feel without depending, and to decide without urgency. Each impulse becomes information. Does this relationship align with my values and principles, or does it drag me into repeating past mistakes? Reason does not suppress emotion, it transforms it. It allows us to experience chemistry as a human phenomenon, to appreciate it without surrendering sovereignty of our mind. Eupatheia, or rational emotion, acts as a guide. We feel the intensity, but we evaluate whether it is constructive or destructive. This balance is vital. To love guided by reason is not coldness or distance. It is the protection of our integrity, the cultivation of healthy relationships, and the avoidance of dependencies that erode inner peace. The use of reason also means discerning between attraction and compatibility. Two people may feel an intense connection, but if their fundamental values, ethics, and vision of life diverge, the relationship is destined to generate conflict and pain. Initial chemistry cannot replace coherence of principles or mutual respect. A Stoic observes these differences with objectivity and makes decisions based on virtue, not fleeting emotion. Furthermore, restraining chemistry with reason protects us from the illusion of absolute necessity. Intense attraction can make us believe we cannot live without the other person, that the bond is indispensable for our happiness. Stoic wisdom reminds us that our peace does not depend on someone else. We can feel desire and connection, but our emotional stability remains under our control. Inner freedom arises when we learn to experience passion without becoming trapped by it. This practice requires discipline and constant reflection. Every encounter, every impulse, every intense emotion becomes an opportunity to train the mind. Ask yourself, am I reacting to the moment, or am I evaluating with clarity? Does this attraction lead me to act with coherence and virtue, or does it push me toward impulsive decisions that perpetuate pain? The answer to these questions defines the quality of our emotional choices and the strength of our autonomy. Ultimately, using reason to restrain chemistry is an act of freedom and self-care. It allows us to enjoy passion without sacrificing peace, to love without depending, and to build bonds where virtue and clarity guide every decision. Chemistry, when observed with discernment, becomes an ally of growth, not an enemy that enslaves us. Stoicism teaches us that initial attraction is only the beginning of the journey. The true relationship is built with virtue, responsibility, and balance, and only reason can guide us away from cycles that wound and toward bonds that nourish our soul and strengthen our inner fortitude. 10th Stoic lesson: choose dignified solitude over toxic company. In a world where connection seems mandatory and solitude is feared, many people remain in harmful relationships out of fear of being alone. They believe that any company is better than none, that suffering alongside someone who hurts is preferable to confronting silence and introspection. The Stoics teach us the opposite. Dignified solitude is a space of strength, clarity, and inner growth, while toxic company, though accompanied, is a poison that erodes our peace, distorts our perception, and perpetuates cycles of suffering. Understanding this distinction is crucial to breaking patterns of relationships that wound. Seneca declared, "We are never less alone than when we are with ourselves." This phrase encapsulates the essence of the lesson. Solitude is not the absence of social life or affection. It is the opportunity to cultivate emotional autonomy, to know ourselves deeply, and to strengthen our virtue. It is in solitude that we learn to sustain our well-being without depending on external approval, love, or validation. Only from this self-sufficiency can we choose conscious, balanced relationships that truly nurture us. Dignified solitude allows us to see with clarity. It frees us from the pressure of maintaining bonds out of obligation, fear, or dependence. It gives us the ability to evaluate others without idealization or projection, to identify harmful behaviors, and to establish firm boundaries. By contrast, toxic company blinds us. Passion or habit makes us tolerate insults, manipulations, or indifference. It makes us forget integrity, temperance, and self-respect. Remaining in such relationships is a form of self-deception, an emotional trap that perpetuates pain and anxiety. Choosing dignified solitude also strengthens resilience. Every moment alone becomes training for the mind and spirit. We learn to sustain our emotions, to make decisions from virtue rather than emotional urgency, and to value our own time and space. Emotional independence protects us from falling into the dependence that makes harmful relationships seem inevitable. We teach ourselves to love ourselves first, in order to love from a place of balance and strength without fear or desperation. Furthermore, dignified solitude offers the freedom to explore our lives and our interests without compromising our integrity. It allows us to recognize what we truly need and what we are willing to accept in an emotional bond. Every future choice is based on clarity, not on need. Every relationship becomes a conscious act of sharing and growing, not an attempt to escape or to compensate for deficiencies. This principle teaches us that true love does not require sacrificing our peace nor tolerating what destroys us. Stoic practice also reminds us that toxic company has cumulative effects. Allowing small violations of respect, tolerating manipulative attitudes, or ignoring lack of reciprocity creates a pattern that repeats and intensifies over time. Every act of tolerance toward what is harmful erodes our inner strength and distances us from the clarity we need to establish healthy relationships. Recognizing this is a call to action. It is better to face solitude than to prolong suffering. The final lesson is an invitation to freedom. Dignified solitude is neither isolation nor lack. It is a conscious choice to prioritize integrity, virtue, and inner peace. It teaches us to sustain ourselves without depending on others' validation, to set clear boundaries, and to value authentic relationships over mere company. Stoicism guides us to understand that our happiness and well-being are non-negotiable, that toxic company is an obstacle, and that true connection arises from freedom, not from need. By choosing dignified solitude, we close the cycle of harmful patterns and open space for relationships that reflect our essence. We learn to love with clarity, to interact from virtue, and to build bonds where inner peace is not sacrificed. This decision, though challenging, gives us back control of our emotional life and allows us to create a more balanced, authentic, and stoic existence, where every relationship elevates us instead of harming us. Solitude ceases to be a feared void and becomes a sacred refuge of strength, clarity, and emotional freedom. Recover your peace and build relationships that elevate. As we arrive at the end of this journey, we feel the strength of the clarity that emerges when we face our emotional lives with honesty. We have explored the roots of why we continue to attract relationships that hurt us: emotional dependence, idealization, the illusion of soulmates, blindness to repeated patterns, and the confusion between need and desire. Each lesson has invited us to look inward, to evaluate not only the other, but also ourselves, to recognize our expectations and emotions, and to understand that true strength and emotional freedom are built on virtue and reason. There are no shortcuts or magical formulas. The path requires introspection, discipline, and a firm will to live with coherence and clarity. Closing cycles does not mean cutting ties impulsively. It means observing with serenity what nourishes and what harms, choosing peace over dependence, and cultivating relationships that reflect respect and virtue. Stoicism teaches us that nothing external, no person, no situation, no bond, can determine our well-being unless we allow it. Therefore, every emotional choice must be rooted in inner autonomy, in the ability to sustain ourselves emotionally, and in the conscious decision not to sacrifice our peace out of fear, need, or illusion. Learning this is liberating, though challenging. It is recognizing that true love is built from freedom, not obsession, and that serenity is not negotiable nor surrendered to anyone who does not honor it. Relationships that wound are not punishments nor permanent errors. They are mirrors reflecting what we have yet to integrate: dependence, idealization, the inability to set boundaries, or the lack of emotional self-sufficiency. By understanding this, we stop blaming the other and begin to take responsibility for our peace and our decisions. Every experience becomes a lesson, every difficult bond an opportunity to practice virtue, discernment, and inner strength. It is not a path of comfort, but of radical honesty with ourselves and with what we deserve and can offer. The introspection we have cultivated reveals a profound Stoic principle. To love and to relate is not an act of total surrender to another, but an exercise in balance between affection and autonomy, desire and reason, passion and clarity. The premeditatio malorum prepares us for the inevitable. Separating the person from the emotional role protects us from idealization. Eupatheia transforms intensity into clarity, and the conscious choice between dignified solitude and toxic company guides us toward authentic relationships. Each practice converges on the same objective: to live with integrity, wisdom, and freedom, without allowing love to become a chain that binds us to cycles of repetitive pain. Looking back, we recognize old patterns, bonds that left scars, impulsive decisions, unrealistic expectations, the fear of solitude. But they are no longer chains, they are signs of learning. Every mistake transforms into guidance, every disappointment into a compass to choose better, every difficult bond into training to sustain inner peace. The awareness of our own responsibility gives us back authority over our emotional life and allows us to choose with reason and virtue, not with urgency or dependence. This closing is also a call to quiet action. Live attentively, observe your emotions, evaluate your bonds, cultivate inner strength, and never sacrifice your peace for anyone. The emotional world will remain unpredictable, but your stability will no longer depend on it. Learning to sustain yourself, to set clear boundaries, to value dignified solitude, and to transform passion into virtue is the greatest freedom you can achieve. There is no greater power than to love with clarity and autonomy, to offer affection without fear, and to relate without losing your essence or your serenity. Finally, understand that relationships that wound are not a reflection of your insufficiency, but of what you still have yet to master within yourself: expectations, emotions, boundaries, and discernment. Every Stoic practice we have explored is a step toward emotional independence, toward the ability to choose healthy bonds, and toward liberation from the negative cycle. Love and companionship cease to be prisons when we understand that our happiness is not negotiable and that our inner peace is inviolable. Thus, living with virtue and clarity allows us to break patterns, transcend pain, and build relationships that elevate us, where freedom, serenity, and wisdom guide every step and every decision, consolidating an emotional path that no longer wounds but transforms and strengthens. And if this journey has shown you new perspectives, released emotions, and awakened clarity, do not stop here. Subscribe to the podcast. Each episode is a space to deepen Stoic wisdom, explore the mind, understand emotions, and transform your life through reason and virtue. Subscribing is not merely following content, it is committing to yourself, to your peace, and to your growth, and opening the door to learnings that transform relationships, decisions, and the way you relate to the world and to yourself. Do it today. Your inner freedom and emotional well-being will be grateful. Your voice is essential here. Every reflection strengthens and elevates our community, reflecting the true value of each individual and contributing to our shared Stoic identity. The reflection that receives the most support will be set as the standard of this community of Stoic minds, a community that does not flee from pain but walks through it with courage, with wisdom, with honor. We will see each other in our next gathering at Stoicism for Winners, where we will continue exploring the riches of Stoic wisdom applied to modern life. Now, take the opportunity to deepen your Stoic practice with new recommended podcast sessions. Follow us so you don't miss any reflection that could help you at just the moment when everything feels overwhelming. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we publish episodes designed to accompany you when life feels heavy, when it's hard to stay calm, when you need a word to remind you who you are. Not following us is to risk missing exactly that lesson that could bring back the peace you have been seeking. Until we meet again, remember, you are the sole owner of your perception, the creator of your peace, and the warrior of your own battle. This is the legacy of Stoicism, the art of being invincible.